Good morning. I'm Joe Fryer. Right now on Morning News Now, patent pending. The Biden administration eyeing a timely end to the pandemic, throwing its support behind waiving intellectual property protections on COVID vaccines. How that will affect worldwide distribution as the CDC publishes a promising new prediction on the virus here in the U.S. Behind bars, 2 American students in Italy have been sentenced to life in prison for being found guilty of murdering a police officer in Rome back in 2019. We'll take you inside the ruling and bring you reaction from both sides of the case. History is watching us. Liz Cheney defiant in a fiery new Washington Post op-ed. The third-ranking House Republican doubles down on her criticisms of former President Trump and her own party. We'll dig into how the GOP is responding. And Poetry in Motion, our week celebrating service continues here at NBC News. And I reunited with one of my favorite teachers. Let's talk about our 5th grade class. You described it as a little bit of a laboratory, right?
Yeah, it was. You were my sweet little guinea pigs.
Poetry lessons to her own published work, Ms. Lund on her love of writing and the very real impact she made on her students, like me. Good to have you with us on this Thursday morning. Savannah is on assignment today. We begin with new signs that the worst of the coronavirus pandemic could soon be behind us here in America. The CDC is predicting a sharp drop in COVID cases in the U.S. by July. Right now, cases are declining, but an average of 48,000 Americans are still testing positive for COVID every day. The United States is also taking a big step toward getting COVID vaccines to the rest of the world. The Biden administration now says it supports waiving patent protections for the vaccines in order to raise global production. We're covering the pandemic around the world this morning. NBC News Now correspondent Dasha Burns is following the latest here in the U.S. And NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley is in London. Dasha, let's start with you. So to get to that sharp decline in cases by July, what has to happen? What does the CDC say needs to be done?
Hey, Joe, good morning. Pretty happy to start with this positive news this morning. According to projections published by the CDC, the U.S. could be through the worst of this pandemic.
Just clarifying,
by July.
I'm in the throat of
these projections are not definitive and they could change if behavior changes. But if people keep getting vaccinated at high rate, if people keep wearing masks and physically distancing when necessary, that it's possible we might be back to some sort of normalcy by Independence Day. I want you to hear from CDC Director Dr. Walensky on this. Listen.
We are not out of the woods yet, but we could be very close. All of us are getting fully vaccinated, and continuing our prevention efforts can help us turn the corner on the pandemic as early as July and set us forward on a path toward a more normal lifestyle.
She also said the models show an even faster decline if more people get vaccinated sooner. She says these models used to show us some pretty grim outcomes, but now they are finally offering some hope for what this summer may bring, Joe.
Let's cheer for the faster outcome there. Now let's turn overseas. Matt, the patent waivers would speed up vaccine production worldwide. The U.S. had been a holdout, but faced increasing pressure to support this. What does the decision from the Biden administration mean?
Well, the decision from the Biden administration has been criticized by members of Big Pharma, those who are advocating for keeping the patents, who say that preserving patents is part of the entire global international system that allows for the kind of innovation that created these vaccines, many of which were, represented by historic scientific breakthroughs. But much of the world, most of the world, much of the international community is really applauding this today. They're saying that this is a decision by the Biden administration that will allow for the vaccine to be produced at a massive scale, particularly in India, where we're seeing record-breaking death tolls. This really doesn't do much for the vaccine companies. Lately, they've been reporting huge, like Pfizer, huge revenues, huge profits. So a lot of people, especially in the international medical community, are going to be saying, why do these companies need to be protected any more than they already are? They're profiting hugely from this pandemic. I spoke with a representative of Oxfam. Here's what he said last night before the announcement that the U.S. was backing this about this whole debate.
the key to ending the pandemic is actually opening up the IP. That, right now we're basically fighting this war against COVID with one hand tied behind our back, where you basically have access to life-saving technologies that are held by a very small number of huge pharmaceutical companies that have monopoly control over how many doses they produce, where they're sold, and at what price.
So all this really means is that this fight isn't really over, Joe. This means that the U.S. is backing a position that was proposed by South Africa and India to waive these requirements, these intellectual property rules. Now it looks as though it's up to the World Trade Organization to make that final decision. Joe?
And Matt, you mentioned there's been all kinds of reaction to this, from Big Pharma to the World Health Organization. What has been the worldwide reaction so far?
I mean, it is overwhelmingly in favor of Joe Biden's decision. Again, the decision hasn't been made on a global level. It's the World Trade Organization. They're meeting today. They were meeting yesterday as well to discuss this issue. Almost everyone in the international community has said that this is a great thing. We heard from the head of the World Health Organization. He called it a monumental moment in the fight against COVID-19. And he says he commends the U.S. decision. All of this is because a lot of these people are against the idea that Big Pharma would be profiting, even though Big Pharma's argument has been that their profits is what is driving all of the innovation that has, in some ways, sort of saved humanity from this pandemic. But the vaccine inequity that has emerged from this whole debate has just gone to show that really a lot of the developing world are now going to be reeling from this disease, and they're in desperate need of the vaccine by any means necessary. Joe?
Dasha, one of the reasons this is so important, the variants. Health experts are still keeping their eyes on COVID variants in the U.S. and around the world. Moderna now says its vaccine booster shot can provide protection against some of them. Tell us what that means for vaccine protection down the line.
Yeah, Joe, that's right. Moderna's variant targeting booster shot appears to protect against the South Africa variant. Interim data from phase 2 trials showed that participants saw an increased level of antibodies against the virus. The booster shot was given 6 to 8 months after participants were initially vaccinated. Now, back in February, the FDA issued guidance that would allow drug makers to make modified therapeutics available to the public without the need for lengthy trials. That's similar to the way that the flu shot is updated every year. Pfizer also looking into a third shot. Back in April, their CEO said that some kind of booster would likely be necessary within the next 12 months, Joe.
All right, Dasha and Matt, lots of news to kick us off around the world this morning. Thank you both. Former President Trump is lashing out at Facebook after the tech giant's oversight board decided to uphold its ban on his account, at least for now. The board said, in part, given the seriousness of the violations and the ongoing risk of violence, Facebook was justified in suspending the former president in the wake of the January 6th Capitol riot. Trump hit back at big tech in a statement posted to his website, calling the decision a total disgrace and saying these corrupt social media companies must pay a political price. Let's bring in our NBC News team for a closer look at this decision. NBC News senior media reporter Dylan Byers and NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray. Dylan, let's start with you. So this oversight board essentially kicked the final ruling back to Facebook, saying it needs to review its decision to indefinitely suspend former President Trump's account within 6 months. What are Facebook's options now?
Yeah, look, what Facebook is really, or pardon me, what the oversight board is really saying to Facebook here is you can't just give us this case and ask us to make a decision without putting some policies in place, or at least some sort of standard for what you would do in the event that a political leader did what President Trump did. And so the three options that the board is giving to Facebook are these. One, establish a timeline for how long Trump is going to be suspended and then let him back on. Two, let him back on now and get rid of the posts that you believe violate your policies. Or three, make a decision to get rid of him altogether and not allow him back on your platforms, not allow him back on Facebook, Instagram, et cetera. But you have to make a decision, is what the oversight board is saying. You can't merely impose a penalty that you've never imposed before that has no basis in previous policy and then ask us to take on the responsibility of making that decision for you. That is a decision that rests in the hands of Facebook alone.
Mark, in addition to the statement from former President Trump, a number of Republicans are weighing in on this decision. What are they saying?
They're lashing out at Facebook. They're saying that the decision by the Oversight Board infringes on the former president's First Amendment rights. They're talking about taking antitrust action. But on that First Amendment situation, of course, the First Amendment ends up reading that government shall pass no law that infringes upon someone's freedom of speech. It doesn't have anything to do with a publicly traded corporation or private company that has a lot more power to do such things when you actually sign user agreements like you do on Facebook to say that I will participate and I will abide by the company's decisions and user agreements. And so, obviously this has kicked up a hornet's nest. Republicans are outraged about this. But to me, the biggest consequence when it comes to 2024 is this really does hurt the former president when we talk about him making another presidential bid, just given the amount of money he was able to use and raise off of Facebook, and also just have the political voice that Facebook and Twitter used to give him.
Yeah, Twitter might be his megaphone, but a lot of folks point out Facebook is where he raises a lot of money. Now, Dylan, this oversight board also had some strong views on how Facebook behaved, right?
Yeah, they absolutely did. And what they said in their statement was, by applying a vague and what they called standardless penalty here, and then asking the board to make the decision without, again, putting any of those policies in place, they were effectively shirking responsibility for a decision that they were supposed to make. And, that was what was in the statement. There was also a call with some of the co-chairs on the board, and the criticism went quite a bit further. They said that there are, in fact, many cases in which Facebook has engaged in what one co-chair called ad hocery, that they're effectively trying to make up rules as they go. And, what I found so interesting about this is this oversight board was created by Facebook with the express purpose of basically the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, saying it should not be left up to one company or one individual, that being Mark Zuckerberg, to make such significant, important decisions about speech. So the board was created to help make those decisions, but now it's putting the ball back in Facebook's court.
Yeah, interesting. Now, Mark, former President Trump also sent a fundraising message after this decision. What was his message to his supporters?
His message was to fight back. And of course, we ended up seeing so many other kind of fundraising solicitations from other Republican entities, like the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, with messages like former President Trump banned from Facebook, please end up giving us money. And again, to try to kind of create a rallying cry among Republicans about this. But, again, we'll have to see what Facebook decides to do after the 6-month period. It certainly seems like Republicans are, sharpening their knives legislatively when it comes to Facebook. And of course, there aren't a lot of big Democratic allies of Facebook on Capitol Hill either.
All right, Dylan, thank you so much. Mark is going to stay with us for this next segment as we talk more about what's happening within the Republican Party. And the battle over leadership of the GOP is spilling out onto the public stage. Embattled House GOP Conference Chair Liz Cheney wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "The GOP is at a turning point. History is watching us." The article from the number 3 Republican in the House came as other party leaders began endorsing a candidate to replace her. Let's bring Mark Murray back in, plus NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell. Leanne, I want to start with you. Let's talk more about this op-ed. What else did Cheney have to say?
Well, Cheney isn't necessarily fighting for the votes to retain her position as number 3 conference chair, which is in charge of messaging for House Republicans. Instead, she is fighting really for the soul of the Republican Party. In this op-ed, she laid out a scathing analysis of what Republicans need to choose. And she's saying that it should not be the choice of the former president who perpetuates lies about the last election and led to January 6th, the insurrection. Instead, she says that Trump is seeking to unravel critical elements of our constitutional structure that make democracy work, confidence in the result of the election, and the rule of law. No other American president has ever done this. She goes on to say in that op-ed that Republicans have a choice to make. This is a critical moment in the Republican Party, and they can choose truth or they can essentially choose lies. And so she is encouraging her Republicans to make the right choice, even though the writing is on the wall that she is going to lose her position in leadership, Joe.
Yeah, and Leanne, a growing number of Republicans are circling around a specific person who they would like to replace Cheney. Tell us more about who that is and why she's attracting so much support.
That's Representative Elise Stefanik of New York. She is someone who came in from upstate New York as a moderate Republican, someone that voted with the party not 100% of the time. She broke with the party. But during the first Trump impeachment, she became a very stringent defender of the former president. She was on his defense team. And she has chosen the path that embracing the president, the former president, is how she's going to be politically. And that has obviously served her well in the short term. Representative Steve Scalise, the number 2 House Republican, through a spokesperson, has come out publicly in support of her and calling on his members to do the same. Joe.
So, Mark, is Liz Cheney right? Is the GOP at this turning point right now? And what does this op-ed tell you about what she knows and what she sees as her future?
Yeah, and again, I think that the handwriting is on the wall. And of course, Leanne and our Capitol Hill team's great reporting that we know where the votes are on this. Liz Cheney has a very shaky situation when it comes to retaining to her job, and she's really not willing to be able to keep it. But with this op-ed, she seems to be trying to make a play for history and say that I'm going to be on the right side of history when it comes to this. It really does strike me, though, that when we're talking about Liz Cheney and the Republican Party, Joe, you and I were just talking about Facebook decision, but we haven't been talking about, at least politically damaging, is Joe Biden. And, you know, Republicans have not had their eyes on Joe Biden, his legislative agenda. We said we're talking about other things. And for Republicans to be able to take back the House of Representatives in 2022, to do well in the Senate contest, they need to start actually turning their fire to the current president of the United States and his agenda. And of course, we have a lot of time to do it. History is on the Republican side on making gains in the 2022 midterms. But this week has been a lost week if you want to turn the fire on Joe Biden and his policies.
Yeah, and we see Mitch McConnell keep trying to do that, trying to put the focus back on Joe Biden in the wake of all this drama within the Republican Party. Leanne, I should ask you, what's next? How could House Republicans remove Cheney from her position? And if they want to do that, when could it happen?
It's a great question, Joe. So the House is back in session next week, and we expect the House Republicans to meet as an entire conference like they do every week when they're in town on Wednesday, which is the first full day that the House will be here. And what will happen is someone was going to have to call a motion, and that motion will call to remove Liz Cheney. It's going to be a secret ballot, most likely. It's a similar process that took place in February after the second Trump impeachment when Cheney's job was on the line. She won that vote by a margin of 2-1. And that vote next week that is expected to take place is likely to be probably the flip scenario, losing that vote. We'll see how many votes she gets, Joe.
We'll see what happens. Leanne and Mark, thank you both. Appreciate it. It's life in prison for 2 American students convicted of murdering an Italian police officer. 21-year-old Finnegan Lee Elder and 20-year-old Gabriel Natale North, both from California, were found guilty by an Italian jury and sentenced yesterday. Their conviction comes 2 years after the stabbing death of an undercover policeman in Rome. The 2 Americans, who were teenagers at the time, claimed that they were acting in self-defense during a botched attempt to buy drugs. For more, let's bring in NBC News foreign correspondent Claudio Labanga, who joins us from Rome. So, Claudio, this is a complicated case that has received a lot of attention, both in the U.S. and, of course, in Italy. So, first of all, just explain what happened on the night of the killing.
Good morning, Joe. Well, you can call this a boys' night out gone seriously wrong. Now, the 2 Americans were enjoying a holiday here in Rome, as you said, in the summer in 2019, when they decided at some point to buy a gram of cocaine. Well, when they realized they were sold instead an aspirin, and therefore they got scammed. Out of reprisal, they stole the backpack of the man who introduced them to the drug dealer and told him they will give it back only in return of the money they spent on the drug and a real gram of cocaine. They arranged a meeting for the swap, but the middleman called the police instead, reporting the theft. the police sent 2 plainclothes officers to the meeting. When the 4 met, well, a violent scuffle, a fight broke out. And during that fight, very quickly, one of the 2 Americans, Finnegan Lee, took out a 7-inch military-grade knife and stabbed the officer 11 times, killing him. He died shortly after that in hospital, Joe.
So life in prison is the harshest criminal penalty there in Italy. What's the reaction to this sentence? Do some feel that it's too harsh?
Well, definitely the defendants and the lawyers of the defense lawyers feel it is too harsh because if you consider, as you said, this is the harshest penalty you can find in Italy. There is no death penalty, and usually it is given out to, serious criminal bosses like mafia bosses. So it was in some way unexpected, even though the prosecution was asking for a life sentence. So in some way, this is the defense lawyers think that they serve this, they use this as an example, and the fact that the man that died was a policeman reinforced the need to give a life sentence. But certainly, one of the lawyers of the Americans, Finnegan, the Italian lawyer of Finnegan Lee, I spoke to him last night right after the verdict, which came out after midnight. He said that this verdict should be seen as a shame for the whole of Italy, that in 40 years of his career, he's never seen anything like it, especially if you consider that these guys nowadays are only 20 and 21 years old. And unless this ruling is overturned in the appeal, then, of course, they will spend their life in prison. Of course, he confirmed that they will appeal and that he said, that the next judge will be more reasonable. Joe, Savannah?
Yeah, so explain what does happen next, what is next for these 2 Americans, and how does that process work moving forward?
Well, we spoke to both the Italian lawyer for Finnegan Lee, and also we just interviewed Craig Peters, who's the American lawyer for Elders, Finnegan Lee Elders family in California, and they both said that, yes, they will appeal, but it will take time. The Italian justice system is very slow, even to just read out the motivations, the reasons behind the judge's decision to inflict a life sentence. They'll have to wait for 90 days. And only then, once they do read the motivations behind the sentence, they will be able to launch an appeal. But this is Italy. It takes a long time for trials to go ahead, and especially also for appeals. And what's worse, of course, is that we're at the time of COVID, so everything is even slowed down.
All right, Claudio, thank you so much. Time for a check on your morning news now. Weather. Bill Cairns is back with us. Hey there, Bill. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Mother's Day forecast starting to come into focus a little bit. We're going to get to that at the end of this. But first, you may have noticed if you wake up this morning in the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, the Northeast, there's a chill in the air. It's sunny, at least in most cases, but it's chilly. Here's why. So we have this huge storm up on the Hudson Bay in Canada, and around this, the winds are just circulating right down out of northern Canada. So unseasonably cool, we'll call it Arctic air, has been rotating down through the northern plains, through the Great Lakes, and now it's arriving in the Northeast. It's not like middle of the winter type cold, but even for this time of year, it's 5 to about 20 degrees below normal for a good chunk of the eastern half of the country, pretty much everywhere east of the Rockies. So as far as what we're dealing with right now, it's been cold. I mean, look at West Virginia, 39 degrees this morning. Pittsburgh's at 40, so people definitely grabbing the sweatshirts and for the kids, or maybe even a light jacket this morning. It'll warm up nicely this afternoon. The typical of May, chilly morning, beautiful afternoon. And about temperatures in the mid-60s for D.C. to New York to Boston to the Northeast. We will see some light rain from Chicago to Indianapolis to St. Louis. And look at the heat building in the Southwest. Phoenix up to 100 today. And some of that heat's going to begin to push into Texas, too. So as we go into Friday, still kind of cool with showers in the Northeast. Temperatures are starting to recover in the middle of the country. Denver up to 81. And how does the weekend look? I was talking about the Mother's Day forecast. So on Saturday, we will see some rain, maybe even a severe storm or two in the middle of the country. That's the storm we have to worry about on Mother's Day. It looks like especially from St. Louis, Indianapolis, Columbus, Lexington, Louisville, and Cincinnati, all those areas, Joe. Make sure you have indoor plans as a possibility because it looks like we will see a period of rain, may even rain for a good chunk of the day. So not great for all the moms, but make the most of it.
Yep, absolutely. Time together is what matters, right, Bill?
Yes.
All right.
Exactly.
Good
point.
Well, yes. All the moms out there. All right, coming up, a legal blow to renters and tenants across the U.S. The pandemic-era moratorium on evictions has now been overturned. Next. A federal judge has overturned the national eviction moratorium, which has helped many people keep their homes during the pandemic. The immediate impact of the ruling is unclear, but it could affect tenants struggling to pay rent. The ruling says the CDC exceeded its authority when imposing a nationwide freeze on evictions. The Justice Department is appealing the ruling. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos joins us now to break it all down. So, Danny, first of all, what did the judge say in this case? Why did he rule the eviction moratorium exceeds the CDC's authority?
Because the Public Health Services Act does give the CDC or the secretary the power to make, quote, such regulations as may be deemed necessary, or some language like that. But as much as that may sound like it gives power to do virtually anything, the next sentence describes what some of those regulations are, and they include destroying animals who could communicate the disease. So what the judge concluded is that, no, this is not a broad grant of authority. There are some very specific things that can be done under the statute, and a national rent moratorium is not one of them.
So could Congress preserve the moratorium by passing an extension and then take responsibility for the order from the CDC?
That is a completely different issue that was addressed by this court, because this was a situation where the CDC, which is part of a government agency, which is part of the executive branch, took action. Congress, on the other hand, has much more power to take action, to enact legislation. So the court would conduct a different analysis if, for example, Congress passed new legislation that allowed for a nationwide rent moratorium. It may not be constitutional ultimately, but it would be a different analysis.
So, Danny, a lot of folks might be wondering what happens during this appeals process. Can landlords start doing anything now to make up for the revenue that they've lost? Could people be evicted?
The next question is whether or not there will be a stay pending appeal. That's another critical issue, maybe as critical as the decision itself. In other words, will we keep the status quo, or will it return to a pre-moratorium era? That's the purpose of a stay, and a court would have to rule on that. But if it goes back to if these landlords can start seeking all their rent, I guess you would say good luck getting blood from a stone, because rent is hard enough to pay every month as it is. Imagine trying to send an invoice to your tenants for back rent of like a year. So if they couldn't pay it during the pandemic, not likely they can pay a massive invoice right now.
Yeah. So if the courts did totally overturn the moratorium, can there even be retroactive action to those renters who took advantage of it during the pandemic?
Exactly right. I mean, the landlords have always been allowed to go after that money, just not right now during the pandemic. So in theory, it's always been the promise that, hey, as soon as this is over, you can go after those tenants. But anyone who's been a landlord or been a tenant knows that, rent is not something you can pay in one gigantic sum in lump, or else we would do it at the beginning of our lease. We pay it little by little because it's a lot of money. So like I said earlier, it's going to be a real long shot if they couldn't pay it during the pandemic to try and get it from them legally after the pandemic in some lump sum.
All right, Danny Savalos, thank you for helping us understand this a lot better. Appreciate it. The Atlanta police officer charged with murder in the shooting death of Rehired Brooks has been reinstated but will remain on administrative leave. Garrett Rolfe was fired from the Atlanta Police Department on June 13th last year, a day after Brooks was shot and killed in a Wendy's parking lot. The Atlanta Civil Service Board said the city had failed to follow its own procedures for disciplinary actions. The incident came only weeks after the murder of George Floyd and sparked protests in Atlanta. Rolfe is charged with felony murder, aggravated assault, and other crimes. He has been placed on leave pending trial, but a date has not yet been set. This morning, a showdown is shaping up at the Texas state capitol. Lawmakers are getting ready to take up one of several controversial restrictive voting bills. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson joins us now from the state capitol there in Austin, where voting rights advocates are planning to show up for today's vote. So, Priscilla, let's start with that legislation that's up for a vote today. What would happen if this passed?
Joe, good morning. That legislation is House Bill 6, and if it passes, it could make some pretty wide-ranging changes to how voting takes place here in Texas. For one, sending vote-by-mail applications, so not ballots, but just the applications to voters who don't request them, would now be a state felony. It would be illegal. And as a reminder, during the pandemic, a number of counties actually did this to folks like those 65 and older who automatically qualified to vote by mail. But if this becomes law, if those applications go out and the voter hasn't requested it, that's going to be a problem. Another thing in this law that has a lot of advocates concerned is that folks who have disabilities or perhaps a language barrier, anything where they would need assistance at the polls, that person helping them is now going to have to fill out a form detailing how they helped them and why that person needed the help. So effectively asking them to disclose whatever that issue was. Joe?
So, Priscilla, people against the bill say they expect to hold a silent protest today inside the Capitol while the vote takes place. What's their message?
Several voting advocates and organizers here in Texas are planning to descend on the Capitol today. They are going to be trying to fill the gallery as this debate and as these proceedings get underway to make it known that they are in opposition to this bill. But of course, if they do make noises or express some, give an outward display of that opposition in the gallery, the entire gallery could be cleared. So we do expect them to remain silent. And I had an opportunity to speak with one of those organizers from Texas Rising and take a listen to what he said about what the message is today.
There are many people who still don't trust the election system. This is not going to increase their trust in that system. So I think that with this bill in place, with the provisions in it, we would be seeing a lot fewer of people like me showing up to the polls and being represented and having their voices heard. So I think it's going to have an incredibly detrimental impact.
And those demonstrators are also planning to stand at the door as lawmakers make their way onto the floor, holding signs in opposition. Joe?
All right, Priscilla, we know you'll be on it all day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Time to take a look at what's making news around the world this morning. NBC's Molly Hunter joins us from London. Hey, Molly, good morning.
Hey, Joe, good morning. We are going to start in India. The numbers there are still incredibly grim, and the international aid arriving is just not enough. Now, take a look at the cases today. A record number of infections, more than 400,000. And, Joe, a record death toll, too, more than 3,700 deaths. And doctors there have two warnings. The real numbers are likely much, much higher, and deaths will spike a few weeks after peak infection. So we will be watching those numbers closely. Now, staying with COVID, meanwhile, in Sydney, Australia, an entirely different picture. The country enforces a 2-week mandatory hotel quarantine for all arrivals, but health authorities there are now hunting for the source of their first local COVID case in more than a month. New Zealand has paused its quarantine-free travel bubble with that city. And finally, happy birthday to Archie. The royal family joined in on the birthday wishes today. He turns 2. It's his final birthday, of course, as an only child before Harry and Meghan welcome baby number 2 this summer. And as an eldest child, my advice to Archie, savor this moment. It will never be the same.
I agree with you. I am also an eldest child. It's nice, though, to become a big brother or big sister, though.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Molly. Coming up, GameStop's controversial stock market ride makes its way to the Hill once again today. What we're expecting to hear from the chairman of the SEC next. The GameStop stock drama is heading back to Capitol Hill. Today, the chair of the SEC, the nation's top markets watchdog, will testify in front of the House Financial Services Committee. The topic, how investors jumped onto GameStop shares earlier this year and the risky bets that led to the rally. NBC News senior business reporter Ben Popkin joins us now to help us break it down. So, Ben, the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, is reportedly going to testify on transparency around short selling. That's when big investors bet, again, that a stock will fall. What could that look like and what would be the impact?
Right. Well, good morning, Joe. You're absolutely right. So Gary Gensler is the top watchdog to watch at this hearing. He's a close ally of Elizabeth Warren, who's known for her favor for stronger regulations in the financial market. With the short selling, it's part of keeping the market healthy. But what drove up the price so high during the GameStop frenzy is that a number of hedge funds had large short positions against GameStop when prices began to rise from these online investors on Reddit and other social media platforms. These large firms were forced to actually buy shares to cover their losses, driving the price sky high. So currently, firms only have to disclose their holdings. Gensler is having the SEC draft proposals that would make them disclose their short positions too. Advocates are looking for this. It would add more transparency to the market. And when there's these massive short positions, hopefully this kind of disclosure would tamp down the frenzy.
All right, so that's the big investors. The chairman will also testify on protecting small investors who could be lured into taking risks with their money on apps. What are we expecting to hear?
Well, Robinhood really took the headlines in the GameStop frenzy. This is the app that can be downloaded to your phone, and people begin trading without having to pay transaction fees very quickly. And both Democrats and Republicans are very concerned about this. Robinhood took heat because they have a lot of gamification in it and made it sort of like stock trading was like playing Candy Crush. There would be bursts of confetti when you executed a trade, and there would be push notifications. So Gensler seems to be strongly indicating in his prepared testimony released ahead of the hearing that he's going to be taking a look at it. He said that we may need to freshen up rules that cover these gamified trading apps. And he also said that the SEC is likely to be taking public comment. And that's an indication. That's one of the first steps in a rulemaking process. So it looks like we'll be seeing some developments there for Robinhood and protecting individual investors. Gensler pointed out that many apps programs, they use nudges and notifications to edge users along. But there's a big difference between Netflix encouraging you to watch a movie that you may end up losing a few hours over versus an app like Robinhood, where a poor trade could impact your ability to pay your rent.
Yeah, very, very different things there. Now, Ben, we're seeing pressure from some Democrats to get tough on Wall Street. You mentioned Elizabeth Warren. What kind of regulation could all this lead to?
There's multiple forms of regulation that could be emerging out of this hearing. One thing that they're looking at is social media manipulation, where bad actors try to send signals to the market through Reddit and other social media. There's also an obscure system called payment for order flow, where Robinhood was essentially paid for data on its users. They're taking a look at that. And also, they're looking at shortening the number of days it takes for these online trades to process. And that final item is something that both Republicans and Democrats are likely to agree on based on previous hearings. So we may see some bipartisanship over the future of money here.
It's hard to say because we see it so rarely. So, all right, Ben, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Something we can all agree on.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Joe.
This week on Meet the Press Reports, Chuck Todd will take a look at the Republican Party's immigration views. How did the party go from Ronald Reagan, who granted amnesty to nearly 3 million undocumented immigrants, to Donald Trump, whose harsh immigration rhetoric and promise to build a wall were the hallmarks of his campaign? In this week's episode, Telemundo's Vanessa Hawk does a deep dive. Here's a preview.
Illegal immigration at the border is now new. In fact, apprehensions peak early in the century, then stabilize for a decade before rising again. Still, a large influx of immigrants has unnerved many Americans who worry about the country's changing demographics.
I think there's been a concern, an angst about the changes in America, and a lot of that has to do, obviously, with how culture changes, how the face of America begins to change.
As you know, they call it the caravan.
Despite his harsh anti-immigrant rhetoric, President Trump gained 4 points among Latinos in the last election. One reason, many Latinos hold traditional conservative views.
I'm a business owner, and I don't want the government to be telling me what to do or to put many regulations on me. For me, that's very important.
Latinos are naturally conservative because we believe in family, because we believe in our right to work and put food on the table for our families, because we believe in free speech, because in our countries where either we or our parents came from, we didn't have that.
It's that kind of conservative-leaning attitude that encourages Republicans like Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar of Florida. She hopes a spirit of bipartisanship will eventually lead to meaningful immigration reform.
All they want is dignity. They do not want to wait for this path to citizenship that never comes. They want dignity now. And what does that mean? For them to be able to work, raise their American children, pay taxes, not commit a crime, and be able to go home for Christmas.
I'm starting to see members of both the Senate and the House coming together. I think they're starting to realize that the only way we're going to arrive at immigration reform is by working in this spirit of bipartisanship.
You can watch this week's episode of Meet the Press Reports tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on NBC News Now or on demand on Peacock starting tomorrow. Time for our CNBC Money Minute, the biggest financial headlines of the day and why they matter to you. Bertha Coombs is with us this morning. Bertha, good morning. Good to see you.
Hey, good morning, Joe. So Google is calling employees back to work, but they still expect about 1 in 5 to continue to work remotely after its offices reopen this fall. They expect another 60% will have a hybrid work week that includes about 3 days in the office and 2 days, quote, wherever they work best. The rest can change their location if they want to a different Google office. Google will also continue offering extra reset days or days off to help cope with the pandemic. Shares of Etsy are under pressure. The online marketplace for handmade goods says sales more than doubled in the most recent quarter. Etsy has seen business boom during the pandemic with overwhelming demand for face masks and other goods. But now the company expects a big slowdown in sales growth as the economy reopens. And Dogecoin, nothing to joke about anymore. This is a meme-based digital currency that was launched back in 2013 as a joke. Yesterday, though, it soared to an all-time high, extending its rally to become the 4th biggest cryptocurrency. Dogecoin is up 14,000% just in 2021. 5 months, 14,000%, taking it past more widely used digital coins such as Ether and Ripple. Now, Dogecoin has a logo that features a Shiba Inu dog, but it has little use as a form of payment. Nonetheless, who's getting the last laugh now? If you put in $1,000 at the end of December, you'd have $120,000 now. Nothing to sneeze at.
That's crazy. I'm also glad you're here because if you weren't, I would have pronounced it dog e-coin. So thank goodness that you're here to tell us how to pronounce it.
I've heard it pronounced Dogecoin. It might get another bump this weekend when Elon Musk hosts Saturday Night Live. He's a big proponent of cryptocurrencies. Dogecoin, one of them.
Good point. One of many reasons to watch this weekend. All right, Bertha, thank you so much. Coming up, from an elementary school desk in Minnesota to the anchor desk here at 30 Rock, it wouldn't have been possible without one of my favorite teachers, someone who helped spark my love of writing. That's next. It's Teacher Appreciation Week, an opportunity to recognize teachers' dedication and the impact they have on students. But is that appreciation reflected in their pay? In a new report from the National Education Association, the average teacher salary nationwide for the current school year is a little over $65,000. It's a number both advocates and many teachers say needs to be higher. Joining me now is Ellen Sherritt, board chair of the Teachers Salary Project. Ellen, good to have you with us this morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, your organization is advocating for higher salaries. What have you learned about what teachers are being paid nationwide? Are they able to make ends meet?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us on the show, Joe, and for raising attention to this issue. Teacher salaries at this point are woefully inadequate. Teachers currently experience a 19% wage gap. That's about $18,000 a year less than other professionals with similar qualifications to teachers. We know that in a quarter of school districts across the country, there is no way for a teacher, even with 30 years of experience, a PhD, to earn more than $60,000. And in almost every school district, over 90%, there's no way for a teacher to reach $100,000 at any point in their career.
So in your mind, what does a fair teacher salary look like?
Well, a few things. First, it would require to close that wage penalty. But second, we want to see teachers no longer having to moonlight. Right now, we know that 59% of teachers are taking on additional work in order to make ends meet. And in 18% of cases, teachers are moonlighting in fields completely unrelated to education. Bartending, driving Uber. In one case, we heard of a teacher who was surrogating twice. She was literally renting out her uterus to make ends meet. We don't want to see any of that happening. But finally, a fair teacher salary is one where we don't have teacher shortages. It's a salary where every student can expect that they're going to show up to the classroom and have an excellent, diverse set of teachers who have their all to give to them.
So, Ellen, what do you want to see change in the next 5 or 10 years, and how does that change happen in your mind?
Well, we at the Teacher Salary Project are committed to working with everyone across the aisle and from all walks of life in order to see teacher salaries increase. And we know that everyone wants to see this happen. 71% of the public believes that teacher salaries are too low, and 2/3 would be willing to increase taxes in order to pay teachers a professional salary level. Our president, for the first time since I've been in this field, is intensely supportive of teacher salaries being increased, as is our vice president. And they just reiterated that commitment that they'd expressed in the campaign trail in a proclamation for Teacher Appreciation Week this week. So from the president to the public, the will is there. We just need to collectively commit to making it happen.
All right, Ellen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
As we continue to celebrate service this week, we're paying tribute to the teachers who impacted us most. This morning, I want to introduce you to my 5th grade teacher, Deb Lund. When I entered her classroom at the beginning of that year, I was interested in writing. By the end of the year, I was passionate about writing, and that passion carried me to my current job as a journalist. We recently reconnected virtually. In my 5th grade classroom at Rogers Elementary School in Minnesota, the kids were students, and so was the teacher. That year, Ms. Lund was finishing up her master's project, which focused on teaching writing. Let's talk about our 5th grade class. You described it as a little bit of a laboratory, right?
Yeah, it was. You were my sweet little guinea pigs. I thought about what I was doing as a writer and how the ways that we're taught in methods courses isn't real writing. But, everyone's got different interests. And when you are only taught to write that way, then you think either it's boring or, I don't like it. This isn't fun.
What was the impact of it, do you think?
I think it was the getting past that idea, that writing is something that's inborn and some people are good at it and some people aren't, and that whatever you did was okay. You probably remember we did a lot of poetry that year. It can help you with any writing at all. Do you remember how you wanted to write everything in rhyme?
You found this poem that I wrote to you when you were leaving. And I literally wrote in the poem, I remember I used to rhyme. You still thought it turned out really good, but now I don't. I'm in such a better mood. I rhyme there.
So, Joe, when I think about you as this kid, there was this spark there. You were very funny, but then also there's this other side where it was sort of like having a student teacher in the room. So...
Was it annoying to an annoying degree?
No.
After my 5th grade year, Ms. Lund moved from Minnesota to Whidbey Island in Washington State, where she continued teaching 5th grade classes, music classes. She was even the school librarian. She also authored several children's books.
Children's books are so important. It boils down to helping people figure out who they want to be and kind of supporting them in that.
What has teaching meant to you? Why is it so important?
You know, I think most people see me as an author, and I still think of myself as a teacher who is an author.
How important is it that we take time to appreciate our teachers?
Wow, please do that. It's everything. And I have so many teachers and mentors that I would not be here if it wasn't for them.
Well, I don't know if I would be here if it wasn't for you, so.
Don't expect me to talk now after that. Wow.
These seeds are planted young, and when they're planted the right way and allowed to bloom and grow, it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I think the seed is there. I think it's just the little, watering and weeding maybe.
Well, you're a good gardener.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.